In the humid haze of a Brooklyn afternoon in July 1979, a quiet garden behind a small Italian restaurant buzzed softly with the sounds of life, clinking glasses, muted laughter, the gentle hum of summer. At one of the outdoor tables sat Carmine Galante, a man both respected and feared, his presence commanding even in silence. He leaned back in his chair, a cigar nestled comfortably between his teeth, eyes half closed as if savoring the simplicity of the moment. The smoke curled lazily around his head, a ghostly halo framing a face that seemed almost at peace. Those who knew him well would later recall that smile, calm, steady, defiant, as though nothing in the world could disturb his confidence. What they didn't know was that within moments, this tranquil scene would become one of the most infamous bloodbaths in Mafia history. For decades, the name Carmine Galante had drifted through the dark undercurrents of New York's organized crime world like a whispered curse. He was the embodiment of ambition unchained, ruthless, cunning, and utterly convinced of his own immortality. Even among men who made their living through violence, Galante was different. There was something unnervingly calm about him, as if the threat of death were merely an occupational inconvenience, not a possibility to be feared. His enemies saw in him a storm wrapped in silence. His allies saw power. His victims, in their final moments, saw the glint of his smile. As the afternoon sun painted long shadows across the restaurant courtyard, Galante's two bodyguards chatted casually, unaware that this would be their final meal as well. The air carried the scent of espresso, basil, and cheap cigars, a typical Brooklyn blend. Yet beneath the hum of conversation, there lingered an invisible tension, a stillness that seemed to hold its breath. In the underworld, death often arrived without warning, disguised as an old friend or an unassuming afternoon. Somewhere nearby, men with cold eyes and steady hands were already preparing to change the course of Mafia history. When the gunman burst into the courtyard, everything happened in seconds. The sound was deafening, short bursts of gunfire cutting through laughter and sunlight alike. Patrons ducked, dishes shattered, and the warm air filled with smoke and chaos. But Galante didn't move fast enough. Some say he never even had the chance. Others claim he saw it coming and accepted it, defiant to the end. When the smoke cleared, the Don who had once commanded empires of fear sat motionless, his cigar still clenched between his teeth, his trademark smile frozen in death. That single photograph, the lifeless body of Carmine Galante leaning back in his chair, his cigar stubbornly unextinguished, would travel the world. Newspapers splashed it across front pages, calling it the end of an era, the day the smiling Don fell. But the image told more than a story of murder, it told of a man whose arrogance had finally collided with his fate. For years, Galante had been unstoppable, a figure who defied the Mafia's unwritten codes and dared to challenge the very council that ruled over New York's criminal order. His death, brutal and public, was more than retribution, it was a message, written in blood, to anyone who thought they could rule alone. As the sirens wailed and detectives swarmed the scene, witnesses whispered in disbelief. Some had known him as a gentleman, a man who tipped waiters well, who dressed impeccably, who spoke softly even when issuing threats. Others only knew the stories, the drug empire that stretched from Sicily to Montreal, the murders he ordered with quiet efficiency, the fear he inspired in men twice his size. Each version of Galante was true in its own way. He was both charismatic and cruel, visionary and reckless, brilliant and doomed. Yet even in death, something about him refused to fade. That image of the cigar became a symbol, of defiance, of hubris, of the strange peace that comes when a man meets the fate he spent his life courting. 2. Understand that final smile, one must journey back through the twisting corridors of Galante's life, from the narrow streets of East Harlem where he was born, to the blood-soaked alleys where he first made his name, to the lavish tables where power was traded like currency. The story of Carmine Galante is not just that of a gangster, it is the story of a man who believed he could bend destiny itself to his will. It is the story of ambition that grew too large, of loyalty bought and sold, of a smile that outlived the man who wore it. Tonight, as the city sleeps and the echoes of that July afternoon fade into memory, we reopen the pages of a life written in shadow. Before the bullets, before the empire, before the legend, there was a boy with a hunger for more. And somewhere in that hunger lies the answer to the question that still haunts the underworld: what made Carmine Galante smile in the face of death? The story of Carmine Galante begins far from the polished suits, luxury cars, and whispered meetings that would one day define his world. It begins in the tight, crowded streets of East Harlem, New York City in the early 1910s, a neighborhood bursting with noise, hardship, and the thick aroma of immigrant life. Tenements leaned on each other like weary giants, laundry lines crossed the narrow alleys, and the voices of Sicilian, Neapolitan, and Irish families blended in the air like a living symphony. It was a place where dreams and desperation shared the same cramped rooms. Carmine Galante was born on February 21, 1910, to Sicilian parents who had come to America seeking opportunity but found only struggle. His father, Vincenzo, worked as a fisherman before taking whatever odd jobs he could find in the city. His mother, Vincenza, kept the family together with quiet endurance, stretching every coin, feeding her children on hope and resilience. Their home was small, but it was filled with the scents of olive oil and wine, and the distant memories of a homeland they would never return to. Yet for young Carmine, America was not a place of promise, it was a battlefield. From the beginning, there was something different about him. Teachers at Public School 79 described him as restless, defiant, and violent. He was bright, but only when it served him. He had little patience for authority, even less for rules. By the age of 10, he was already leading other boys into petty mischief, stealing fruit from carts, picking pockets, running errands for local bootleggers. There was a certain coldness in his eyes, even then, a stillness that unnerved adults. When reprimanded, he wouldn't argue. He would just stare, unblinking, as if memorizing the face of anyone who dared to cross him. By 14, Galante had dropped out of school entirely. The streets of East Harlem became his classroom, and his teachers were the men who controlled them. He learned that power was earned through fear, respect through violence, and survival through loyalty. He was drawn to the men in sharp suits who seemed to glide through the neighborhood untouched by the chaos around them. They spoke softly, carried themselves with confidence, and never waited in line. They were the kind of men who made the police look the other way. To a young boy born in poverty, they represented everything America had promised but never delivered. As Prohibition began to transform New York, the neighborhood changed too. Bars went underground, money flowed through secret channels, and violence became routine. For a clever and ruthless teenager, the streets offered both opportunity and danger. Carmine became known to the local gang leaders not for his size or strength, but for his nerve. He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. Once, when accused of shortchanging a bootlegger, he pulled a knife on the man twice his age. Instead of punishment, he earned a job. His first serious brush with crime came not long after. Police reports from the mid-1920s describe a young delinquent named Carmine G., arrested multiple times for assault and robbery. But witnesses often refused to testify. Whether out of fear or respect, they stayed silent. Even then, Galante understood one of the underworld's most sacred rules: silence is power. At home, his parents were helpless. His father tried to discipline him, but Carmine had already outgrown parental control. His mother wept quietly, sensing that her son was drifting into something she didn't understand, a darkness she couldn't pull him from. By 16, he was spending more time in pool halls and back rooms than under his own roof. The East Harlem of those years was a breeding ground for future mobsters. The Morello crime family, the first major Sicilian Mafia clan in America, operated nearby. Their influence touched every corner: gambling, loan sharking, extortion, even politics. It was inevitable that a street-smart, fearless youth like Carmine would attract attention. He began running errands for the Morellos, delivering envelopes, collecting debts, watching how men with power moved through the world. Every small task was a lesson in dominance, deception, and survival. The more he saw, the more his ambitions grew. Carmine didn't want to be a messenger forever, he wanted to be the man giving the orders. He was fascinated by how easily fear could bend people, how violence, used correctly, could be a form of language. The idea of becoming a man of respect, a uomo di onore, took hold in his imagination. He didn't dream of wealth for comfort, he dreamed of it for control. Yet beneath that ambition was something colder, something shaped by years of watching his family struggle and the world ignore them. To him, compassion was weakness, and weakness meant defeat. The kindness his mother taught him was replaced by calculation, the humility of his father replaced by the thrill of power. He learned to read people like he read the streets, instinctively, sharply, always looking for advantage. By the time he turned 20, Carmine Galante was no longer just another street punk. He was a name that circulated among whispers in East Harlem taverns. Police officers knew him, but couldn't pin him down. Small-time crooks feared him. Older gangsters began to notice the way he carried himself, quietly, deliberately, with the composure of someone twice his age. He had already spent short stints in reformatories and city jails, each one hardening him further. When he walked out of those iron gates, he didn't walk away from crime. He walked deeper into it. And so, from the grit and poverty of East Harlem emerged a young man who would one day strike fear into New York's most powerful families. The boy who once stole fruit from street vendors would soon traffic in fortunes. The restless child who defied every teacher and cop would soon defy the very council of the Mafia itself. But at this stage, he was still just Carmine, a sharp, dangerous young man with a smirk that seemed to say he already knew what fate had in store for him. The streets had given him everything he needed, fearlessness, cunning, and the understanding that rules existed only for the weak. He was ready to climb higher, to trade street corners for crime families, and to carve his name into the foundation of organized crime. In the shadow of those crowded tenements, as the city lights flickered to life each night, Carmine Galante looked out over East Harlem not as a boy from the slums, but as a king in waiting. By the time Carmine Galante reached his late teens, the restless boy from East Harlem had transformed into a young man whose reputation preceded him. The streets had already molded him, sharp instincts, cold eyes, and a presence that demanded attention. New York in the 1930s was a city divided by power and desperation, a metropolis recovering from the Great Depression and reshaped by crime. Beneath the glittering surface of jazz clubs and speakeasies, an invisible empire thrived, one built on bribes, blood, and silence. It was in this world that Galante began to climb. He started small, working for various small-time racketeers who operated under the umbrella of larger mafia families. His tasks were simple at first, delivering packages, collecting protection money, intimidating shop owners who were late on payments. But unlike other young men eager to prove themselves with noise and violence, Carmine was quiet, almost unnervingly so. He had a way of standing still while others lost their temper, of letting silence do the talking until his words cut sharper than any blade. People said that when Galante stared at you, it felt like he was already deciding your fate. Through the bustling Italian neighborhoods of East Harlem and the Bronx, his name began to spread. Older mobsters took notice. He didn't waste time boasting about his connections or picking unnecessary fights. He simply followed orders with precision and never spoke out of turn. In a world where loyalty meant survival, his ability to listen, and act without hesitation, made him invaluable. Soon, he began working under the watchful eyes of powerful figures like Vito Genovese and Joseph Bonanno, men who would later become pillars of the American Mafia. Galante's early assignments often involved violence, but it was the way he carried out that violence that impressed his superiors. He was efficient, disciplined, and completely devoid of hesitation. If a debt needed to be collected, he collected it. If a message needed to be sent, he delivered it, with bullets, if necessary. His reputation as a man who could be trusted to handle delicate matters spread quickly. Police reports from the early 1930s began to mention his name more frequently, often linked to robberies, assaults, and gang-related incidents, though charges rarely stuck. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence vanished. Fear protected him better than any lawyer ever could. The Mafia at this time was undergoing its own transformation. The old Sicilian traditions were clashing with the modern vision of younger, more ambitious men like Charles, Lucky, Luciano, who sought to turn crime into a business. The Castellammarese War, a brutal conflict between rival Mafia factions, had recently ended, leaving behind a fragile peace and a new power structure. Luciano's commission unified the families under a cooperative system, each family controlling its own territory and business. And in that new order, the Bonanno family, led by Joseph Bonanno, was quietly rising. Carmine Galante saw his opportunity. He aligned himself with Bonanno's faction, drawn to their Sicilian roots and disciplined style. Bonanno, known for his intelligence and calm authority, recognized something rare in Galante: absolute fearlessness paired with an instinct for power. In a world where arrogance often got men killed, Galante's confidence was measured, almost calculating. He did not seek attention, but attention seemed to find him. His brutal efficiency and silence spoke volumes. It was during this time that Galante began working as an enforcer for the Bonanno family. His duties expanded beyond simple street collections to enforcing loyalty within the ranks. If someone owed money or betrayed trust, Galante was the one sent to make it right. His methods were simple and effective. He didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He delivered punishment with the same calm expression he wore in casual conversation. Those who survived encounters with him described the same haunting image: a man who smiled faintly as he broke bones, a man who seemed more fascinated by death than repelled by it. The underworld began calling him Lilo, a nickname derived from his childhood but now whispered with a mixture of respect and fear. He was known to be fiercely loyal to his superiors but utterly merciless to anyone who disrespected them. There are stories, half truth, half legend, of Galante handling a dispute in a bar by calmly finishing his drink, then walking outside to retrieve a pistol before returning to settle the matter without a word. Whether true or exaggerated, such tales built his mythology. He began to frequent places where men of influence gathered: Italian cafes, cigar shops, private backrooms in Little Italy. He didn't drink excessively or gamble much. Instead, he observed. He studied the hierarchy, the flow of money, and the unwritten rules that governed the Mafia world. He understood early that power wasn't only about violence, it was about perception. If people believed you were dangerous, you didn't have to prove it every time. Fear, once earned, became self-sustaining. Despite his growing reputation, Galante was still at the bottom of the Mafia's ladder. He was a soldier, an errand boy in the grand scheme of organized crime. But inside, he was already thinking like a boss. He watched how Joseph Bonanno managed his men, not through shouting, but through quiet influence. He noticed how Bonanno's calm demeanor made others lean in to listen, how control could be maintained through silence rather than spectacle. Galante adopted this philosophy as his own. His first major step toward true recognition came when he began working on smuggling operations linked to the remnants of the Prohibition era. Even after alcohol was legalized in 1933, illegal distribution networks continued to operate, branching into new ventures: narcotics, gambling, and protection rackets. Galante used his street knowledge and connections in East Harlem to help manage these operations, ensuring that money flowed smoothly to the Bonanno coffers. But his ambition was larger than anyone realized. He didn't just want to be part of the system, he wanted to dominate it. He began to make quiet alliances, both within and outside the Bonanno family, positioning himself for the day he could rise higher. Those who knew him then described a man of contrasts: calm but violent, polite but unpredictable, disciplined yet constantly restless. His silence was as dangerous as a loaded gun. By his mid-20s, Galante had already spent time behind bars for assault and robbery. Prison, however, did not humble him, it sharpened him. Inside, he observed the way criminal networks operated even within confinement. He learned patience. He learned how to manipulate without words. When he was released, he didn't return to the streets as a lost youth. He returned as a man who understood power in its purest form, control through fear. The boy from East Harlem had become a rising force, no longer defined by poverty but by the reputation he had carved with his own hands. He was now fully immersed in the world of organized crime, moving seamlessly between the shadows of Little Italy and the docks of Brooklyn, where shipments of contraband arrived nightly. Every handshake, every favor, every whispered promise pulled him deeper into a world where trust was a currency more fragile than gold. As the decade drew to a close, Carmine Galante stood on the threshold of something greater. He had the loyalty of dangerous men, the respect of his superiors, and the kind of reputation that made both police and criminals tread carefully around him. He had become the perfect weapon, calm, disciplined, and utterly without conscience. The foundations of his future empire had been laid. But the next chapter would transform him from a mere enforcer into one of the most feared assassins in Mafia history, a man whose name would soon echo beyond the streets of New York, carried by whispers and smoke, like the quiet promise of a storm. By the early 1920s, Carmine Galante had already built a reputation that few teenagers could ever imagine earning. On the outside, he looked like any other tough kid from East Harlem, short, dark-haired, with eyes that always seemed to be studying people. But inside, something was different. Carmine wasn't reckless for the sake of chaos, he was deliberate. Every brawl, every petty theft, every gang skirmish taught him a lesson about survival, loyalty, and power. He was learning the rules of the streets long before he even knew the name of the man who would one day rule them, Joe Bonanno. As a teenager, Galante ran errands for local mobsters, small-time operators connected to larger mafia families that had come over from Sicily decades earlier. In that era, the Italian mafia was still transforming, from secret Sicilian brotherhoods into something far more organized, structured, and deeply rooted in American soil. Carmine, sharp and fearless, absorbed it all like a student sitting quietly in the back of a classroom. He learned how money moved from illegal alcohol to gambling, how respect was earned not through kindness but through fear, and how silence was the ultimate virtue. When Prohibition hit in 1920, the streets of New York changed overnight. Alcohol, suddenly outlawed, became liquid gold. For mobsters, it was a time of opportunity, and for young men like Galante, it was a classroom in power dynamics. The once quiet bars and restaurants turned into secret speakeasies, guarded by men with guns and owned by men with ambition. Carmine started working as muscle, delivering shipments, protecting trucks, and sometimes, making examples out of those who got in the way. There was one night, the kind that would stay with him forever. A rival crew tried to hijack a shipment he was guarding. The air was heavy with tension, the kind that makes your pulse slow rather than quicken. Carmine didn't panic. He acted. The story goes that when the dust settled, the rival crew had learned a lesson about who they were dealing with. Violence came easily to him, but it wasn't just the act, it was the calmness, the precision, the emotionless control that made others uneasy. It was then that people started calling him Lilo, short for Carmelo, but also whispered another nickname, the Smiling Don, because he often smiled right before or after doing something ruthless. Galante's fearlessness drew attention from serious men, men who had the power to shape his future. He started doing small jobs for the Mafia's Brooklyn factions, mostly for the Bonanno family's early network. Joe Bonanno himself, a shrewd and calculating man from Castellamare del Golfo, Sicily, took note of Galante's talent for both discipline and brutality. Bonanno valued soldiers who didn't talk and didn't hesitate. Galante was both. But Carmine wasn't content being just a soldier. He was observant. When the older gangsters spoke about business, how to smuggle liquor, bribe politicians, or keep the police quiet, Carmine listened. When they talked about loyalty, he understood it wasn't about friendship, it was about power, money, and the illusion of honor. In time, he started building his own small crew, men he trusted to follow him, not because they liked him, but because they feared the consequences of not doing so. The 1930s brought both opportunity and chaos. As the Mafia grew stronger, the city became divided among its 5 families. Wars were fought not just with guns but with betrayals and quiet assassinations. Galante, still young but already known, learned how to survive in the gray spaces, doing business with one side while pretending loyalty to another, always managing to stay one step ahead of the fallout. One of his most significant lessons came from witnessing how leaders fell. In the world of organized crime, one mistake, a wrong alliance, a careless word, or a single misstep, could turn a king into a corpse. Galante studied these falls carefully. He began to understand that true power didn't come from violence alone. Violence could earn you fear, but intelligence earned you longevity. Behind the hard shell, Galante had a cold, analytical mind. He could read people quickly, anticipate moves, and manipulate outcomes to his benefit. That skill would later make him invaluable to the Mafia's upper ranks, and equally dangerous to them. He was learning not just how to kill or steal, but how to lead, how to control, and how to make himself indispensable. As he moved through these early years, Galante's legend began to grow quietly. Police started keeping tabs on him, though few could ever pin anything serious on him. Every time he was questioned, he remained calm, polite even. He'd light a cigarette, smile faintly, and answer with just enough words to appear cooperative, but never enough to be useful. Detectives walked away frustrated, and other mobsters whispered, "That kid's got ice in his veins." He lived by one principle: never let emotion rule your actions. In a world fueled by greed and blood, that made him different. Most men in the Mafia were ruled by pride or temper, but Galante's calmness unnerved even his peers. When someone insulted him, he smiled. When he was double-crossed, he pretended to forgive, until the time was right to settle the score. By his mid-20s, Carmine Galante had transformed from a street thug into a rising underworld tactician. The kid from East Harlem had become a man who understood both the art of violence and the politics of survival. His education was complete, not from books or classrooms, but from alleys, smoky backrooms, and the silent lessons of watching powerful men fall. What he didn't know was that this education would prepare him for something much larger, the world beyond New York, where drugs, international trade, and Mafia diplomacy would define a new era. For now, he was ready for the next chapter. The city had taught him everything he needed to know, and he was about to use it to rise higher than anyone expected. But as every dawn learns, the higher you rise, the harder the fall. And in Galante's world, every lesson came with a price, sometimes paid in blood. The 1930s in New York were a storm of power, greed, and quiet murder. The streets were ruled not by laws, but by whispers, the kind that could make or end a man overnight. It was during this dangerous and unpredictable time that Carmine Galante found himself drawn deeper into the heart of organized crime. The lessons he'd learned from the streets, discipline, silence, precision, would soon become his greatest assets as he entered the orbit of one of the most powerful and secretive Mafia leaders of all time, Joseph "Joe" Bonanno. Bonanno was different from the brash mobsters who flaunted their money and power. He was calculated, cold, and visionary, the type of man who saw crime not as chaos but as structure. To him, the Mafia was a business empire, one that could rival any corporation in America. When Bonanno met Carmine Galante, he saw something rare, a man who shared his strategic mindset, but who was unafraid to get his hands dirty when the situation demanded. Their connection began quietly. Galante started as an enforcer for the Bonanno family, taking orders, carrying out hits, and protecting the family's interests in Brooklyn and East Harlem. He was loyal, ruthless, and reliable, the perfect soldier. But what set him apart wasn't just his willingness to do violence, it was how he did it. Galante operated like a professional, never impulsive, never sloppy. His murders were methodical, efficient, and left no witnesses. During the late 1930s, tensions were rising within the Mafia's hierarchy. The Castellamarese War, a brutal internal conflict that had reshaped the New York underworld earlier that decade, had ended, but its aftershocks lingered. The new five families were still stabilizing, and alliances were fragile. Every dawn was testing his strength, watching for weakness. Bonanno, though still young, had emerged as a major player. He needed men he could trust completely, soldiers who would carry out his will without question. Carmine Galante fit that role perfectly. The war may have been over on paper, but violence still simmered beneath the surface. Rivals from other families occasionally tested boundaries. Informants whispered. Old grudges resurfaced. Galante became Bonanno's blade in the shadows, a man sent to deliver messages that no one wanted to put into words. When someone crossed the Bonanno family, Galante made sure the streets remembered why that was a mistake. It was during this time that his legend began to grow among his peers. Stories circulated of a young enforcer who walked calmly into a crowded bar, smiled, ordered a drink, and then shot his target in cold blood before finishing his whiskey and walking out. Whether the tale was true or embellished, it didn't matter. The message was clear: Carmine Galante was a man who could kill without blinking, and do it with style. But there was more to him than just muscle. Galante had a gift for organization. He started managing gambling rackets and protection schemes, learning how to balance violence with diplomacy. He knew when to use fear and when to use respect. He kept his men loyal not with charm, but with consistency. If you worked for Galante, you got paid. If you betrayed him, you disappeared. As his influence grew, so did Bonanno's trust. By the early 1940s, Galante was no longer just a soldier, he was becoming an advisor, someone Bonanno could rely on to handle sensitive matters. One of his key responsibilities became managing disputes between street crews. When two factions clashed over territory or money, Galante stepped in. His solution was usually simple: one crew walked away alive, the other didn't. The calmness that once made him seem emotionless now made him powerful. Men feared him not because he shouted, but because he never needed to. His smile became his signature, a small, unsettling grin that told people everything they needed to know without a word. It was that same unsettling calm that earned him his enduring nickname, the Smiling Don. The 1940s also marked a shift in Mafia business. With World War II raging overseas, smuggling and black market operations boomed. Carmine, ever the opportunist, found himself involved in importing and distributing goods that were scarce in wartime: cigarettes, alcohol, even rationed materials. The profits were enormous, and Bonanno trusted him to handle logistics quietly. Galante thrived in the gray zones, where legality blurred and profit reigned supreme. During these years, he also made valuable connections beyond New York. Sicilian contacts began to take note of the young Bonanno enforcer with the cold eyes and sharp mind. Galante understood the value of international ties. He spoke some Sicilian dialect, respected the old traditions, and knew how to present himself as both American and Sicilian, a rare bridge between worlds. Yet, as always, his rise attracted attention, and enemies. Law enforcement began to take note of his activities. The police reports described him as calm, polite, and cooperative, but beneath that demeanor was a man whose fingerprint seemed to vanish from every crime scene. In 1936, he was briefly arrested for assault and robbery, but the charges didn't stick. Witnesses recanted. Evidence disappeared. Galante walked free, smiling as always. Within the Bonanno ranks, some resented his growing power. Older mobsters whispered that Galante was too ambitious, too ruthless. But Bonanno, pragmatic and cautious, ignored them. He needed men like Carmine, men who could do the things others wouldn't. Together, they expanded the family's reach into labor racketeering, narcotics, and union control. By the time the 1940s closed, Galante was no longer just a soldier, he was a trusted lieutenant, a man with influence that reached beyond his own neighborhood. He had proven himself indispensable. The kid from East Harlem had become one of Bonanno's most valuable weapons, a strategist in the making, molded by war, tempered by blood, and motivated by a hunger that went beyond money. But what made Carmine truly dangerous wasn't just his skill at violence, it was his understanding of its purpose. Violence wasn't the goal, it was a means to build power, to send messages, to maintain control. And in the years ahead, that philosophy would take him from the streets of Brooklyn to the international drug trade, where he would become one of the most feared figures in Mafia history. For now, though, the stage was set. The Bonanno family was rising, their power solidified. Galante stood at Joe Bonanno's side, a loyal enforcer turned strategist, the quiet storm gathering strength in the shadows. No one could yet imagine how far he would go, or how violently his story would one day end. When World War II finally came to an end in 1945, the world changed, and so did organized crime. Soldiers returned home, industries flourished, and America began its climb toward prosperity. But beneath the surface of this new order, the Mafia was evolving into something bigger, more global, and far more profitable. Carmine Galante, the quiet enforcer who once prowled the backstreets of East Harlem, was ready to take full advantage of that transformation. The war had disrupted old criminal networks, but it had also created new opportunities. American troops had spent years stationed in Italy and Sicily, opening routes that could later be exploited by the mob. With post-war reconstruction came chaos, and in chaos, men like Galante thrived. The black markets in Europe were overflowing with goods and desperate people. Smuggling, bribery, and corruption became easy for those with the right connections. And Galante, who had already begun building bridges with Sicilian underworld figures during the 1940s, saw a door open that others hadn't yet noticed. After the war, Galante began traveling more frequently, expanding the Bonanno family's reach beyond New York. Sicily became his second home. There, he met with powerful Mafia clans who were eager to rebuild their wealth after years of hardship under Mussolini's regime. The Sicilian Mafia, known as Cosa Nostra, our thing, was regaining strength, and Galante offered them something invaluable, access to American markets. In return, they offered him something equally precious, a steady supply of heroin. This was the birth of what would later become known as the French Connection. It wasn't just a movie title or a story of crooked cops, it was a real, global narcotics network, and Galante was one of its architects. The scheme was simple but brilliant. Heroin would be processed in French laboratories, using raw opium from the Middle East. It would then be shipped through Sicily to the United States, hidden in crates, cars, and shipping containers. Once it reached New York, Galante's men distributed it quietly through the Bonanno family's channels. For Carmine, drugs weren't just a business, they were a revolution. He saw narcotics as the future of organized crime. Gambling and extortion had their limits, but heroin was endless profit. 1 kilo could turn into millions once cut and sold on the streets. To him, it wasn't a moral question, it was mathematics. But Galante's rise through this new criminal era wasn't without turbulence. In 1945, not long after the war ended, he found himself in serious trouble. He had been linked to the assassination of a police officer, and the authorities were determined to make it stick this time. The case against him was strong, witnesses, ballistics, motive, yet Galante remained calm. He knew the system, and more importantly, he knew how to bend it. Witnesses were intimidated, evidence disappeared, and lawyers were paid handsomely. Despite the public outrage, the charges were eventually dismissed. Galante walked free once again. To the world, it looked like another mobster beating the system. But to those inside the Mafia, it confirmed something deeper: Carmine Galante was untouchable. His calmness under pressure, his control over witnesses, his silent authority, these things made him seem invincible. Joe Bonanno noticed, and from that point on, Galante became more than a trusted lieutenant. He became Bonanno's emissary, a man who could handle delicate international business far from American soil. During the late 1940s and into the 1950s, Galante frequently traveled between New York, Montreal, and Palermo. Each city had its own role in his growing empire. In Montreal, he helped establish a Canadian foothold for drug trafficking, a key point in the smuggling route. Canada's ports were less scrutinized than those in New York, and its borders with the U.S. were porous. From there, drugs could flow south in waves, feeding the addiction that was slowly spreading across American cities. In Palermo, Galante built relationships that would last a lifetime. He attended secret meetings in countryside villas, where Sicilian dons spoke in whispers and hand gestures. They trusted him because he understood them, not just their language, but their code. He respected omerta, the vow of silence, more than most American mobsters did. And in turn, they gave him something most Americans could never earn: Sicilian respect. By the early 1950s, Galante's reputation had outgrown New York. He was known as Il Americano, the American, among his Sicilian counterparts, a symbol of the bridge between Old World honor and New World opportunity. In the United States, law enforcement agencies were beginning to notice an unusual rise in heroin imports, but they couldn't trace the source. Galante made sure of that. He used layers of intermediaries, false companies, and coded communications to stay hidden. In this new era, his power was growing faster than anyone realized. Within the Bonanno family, he had become indispensable, the man who managed the international operations while Bonanno focused on keeping peace among New York's 5 families. Galante was more than a lieutenant now, he was the family's gateway to a fortune. Still, Galante was cautious. He knew power came with risk. The more money he made, the more enemies he attracted. Some within the Mafia were skeptical of the narcotics trade. Men like Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino saw its potential, but others, including Bonanno himself, were wary. Heroin brought fast wealth, but it also brought heat from federal agencies. The Mafia had survived for decades by keeping a low profile, and drugs threatened that balance. Galante didn't care. He saw himself as a visionary, the man who could transform the Mafia from a local racket into a global network. The world belongs to those who take it, he once told an associate, a rare moment of boastful honesty. That mindset made him both admired and feared. Yet, despite his growing influence, Carmine remained an enigma. He wasn't a man who sought public recognition. He dressed modestly, spoke quietly, and kept his emotions hidden behind that ever-present faint smile. To outsiders, he looked like a businessman, polite, reserved, even gentle. But those who worked under him knew better. That smile wasn't warmth, it was a warning. By the end of the 1950s, Galante had transformed himself from a local enforcer into an international operator. He had tasted global power, controlled a flow of drugs worth millions, and built alliances that stretched across oceans. But in doing so, he had also set forces in motion that would one day consume him. The narcotics trade, the very empire he helped build, would later bring federal wrath and Mafia betrayal down upon his head. For now, though, Carmine Galante stood at the edge of a new criminal age, one he helped design, one he believed he could control. The streets had taught him how to survive. Sicily had taught him how to rule. But as every Don eventually learns, no empire, no matter how global, lasts forever. And in Galante's world, every victory carried within it the seed of its own destruction. By the early 1950s, Carmine Galante had become more than a New York mobster, he had become a transatlantic power broker, a man who moved between the dark alleys of Brooklyn and the sun-soaked hills of Sicily with equal authority. What began as a few business trips to meet the old families had evolved into something much larger, the foundation of a global heroin empire. This was the era when Galante's cunning and vision reshaped the underworld, when he turned the Bonanno family from a neighborhood operation into a key player in an international narcotic syndicate that would soon flood America's streets with heroin. To the outside world, Galante's visits to Sicily appeared routine, business, family, cultural nostalgia. But those who knew him understood what was really happening. Each visit was another link in a growing chain, one that connected Sicilian producers, French chemists, and American distributors. The Sicilian Mafia had the manpower and the loyalty, the French Corsicans had the laboratories to process raw opium into pure heroin, and the American Mafia, led in this case by Galante, had the distribution network ready to turn powder into profit. This complex system would later be called the French Connection, but in its early days, it was a quiet experiment, secretive, cautious, and incredibly lucrative. The opium came from the Middle East, from places like Turkey and Lebanon, and traveled to Marseille, France, where skilled chemists turned it into refined heroin. From there, it was shipped into Sicily, then smuggled into North America through ports in Montreal and New York. Carmine Galante was at the center of it all. He handled the logistics, the diplomacy, and the money. He negotiated with Sicilian families, ensuring trust and mutual benefit. He oversaw the shipping routes, making sure every step of the operation remained hidden behind layers of legitimate business. To the untrained eye, he appeared to be a modest importer, a man who ran warehouses and shipping companies. But behind those facades flowed a fortune in narcotics. His Sicilian connections were personal as well as professional. The island had always held a mystical pull over him. It was the homeland of his parents, the place where Mafia tradition was born. The men he met there, the old dons with weathered faces and watchful eyes, saw something in Galante that reminded them of themselves. He wasn't just another loud American gangster chasing money. He was disciplined, traditional, and above all, loyal to the old code of silence, omerta. One of his closest Sicilian contacts was Gaetano Tano Badalamenti, a future power in the Sicilian Mafia who shared Galante's vision for international collaboration. The two men worked together to create supply lines and safeguard shipments. Meetings were held in dimly lit villas or countryside estates, away from prying eyes. There were no written contracts, no paper trails, only trust sealed with handshakes and the knowledge that betrayal meant death. Under Galante's direction, the Bonanno family began to reap enormous rewards. The drug trade was risky, yes, but it was also immensely profitable. A single shipment could bring in hundreds of thousands of dollars, all untraceable, all tax-free. For the Bonannos, this influx of cash elevated them above rival families. Even Joe Bonanno, who had initially been cautious about narcotics, couldn't ignore the financial benefits. While he continued to insist that his family stay respectable in appearance, he quietly allowed Galante to run the show behind closed doors. But with power came scrutiny. Law enforcement agencies began noticing patterns, unexplained wealth, unexplained disappearances, and a growing number of addicts in American cities. Federal narcotics agents started tracking shipments, tracing them back to European sources. They didn't yet know Galante's full role, but his name was beginning to surface in confidential reports. Still, Galante was always one step ahead. He used coded language, indirect routes, and trusted couriers. Whenever the heat grew too intense, he would simply vanish to Sicily for months at a time. In Sicily, Galante wasn't seen as a fugitive, he was seen as royalty. He moved with ease among the island's most dangerous men, always calm, always polite, always in control. He understood the unspoken rules: respect the local bosses. Don't flaunt your power, and never let outsiders see your hand. And so, in the towns around Palermo and Castellamare del Golfo, he was treated not as a guest, but as a brother. Those who met him often remarked on his contradictions. He could be charming, even paternal, offering wine and stories of America. But behind that warmth was an iron will. If a deal went wrong, or a shipment was intercepted, Galante's response was swift and merciless. He believed that fear was the only currency that never lost value. Back in New York, his reputation had grown legendary. He had become a ghost, a man rarely seen, but whose influence was felt everywhere. Associates whispered about his ability to make problems disappear, his calm demeanor even in chaos, his eerie smile that appeared before bad news struck. Some began to fear that Galante's reach extended beyond the Bonanno family itself, that he was slowly building a power base of his own, independent from Bonanno's control. This quiet accumulation of influence was no accident. Galante was patient. He understood that the greatest mistake a mobster could make was to believe his own myth too early. So he waited. He let others bask in the limelight, letting Bonanno be the face of the family while he remained in the shadows, the unseen architect behind its financial empire. But even as the money poured in and alliances deepened, cracks began to form. The old-school bosses of New York were uneasy about the narcotics trade. They saw the mounting pressure from the U.S. government, the increasing number of arrests, and the growing addiction crisis on the streets. The Commission, the Mafia's governing council, had long held an unspoken rule: stay away from drugs. It was too visible, too volatile, too dangerous. Galante didn't care. He saw that rule as outdated, a relic of a smaller, poorer time. To him, heroin was the future, the product that would make the Mafia truly global. "The world changes," he once said to a confidant. "Those who stay afraid will be left behind." That philosophy defined him. It made him rich, powerful, and feared, but it also made him enemies. Men like Carlo Gambino and Lucchese boss Tommy Lucchese quietly began to take note of Galante's growing independence. They respected his ambition but didn't trust it. He was too bold, too unpredictable, and too self-assured. As the 1950s turned to the 1960s, the seeds Galante had planted began to bloom, but so too did the resentment, suspicion, and envy that would one day destroy him. For now, though, the smiling Don stood at the height of his power. He had built an empire on silence, loyalty, and blood. From the hills of Palermo to the streets of Brooklyn, his network stretched unseen, unstoppable, and unmatched. But in the Mafia, the higher you climbed, the more visible you became, and the more men waited for the moment you slipped. Carmine Galante's heroin empire was thriving, but his enemies were already gathering in the dark, watching, waiting, and whispering the same question: how long could one man stay untouchable? As the 1970s deepened, Carmine Galante returned to the streets with a quiet but deadly intention: to take what he believed was rightfully his. The world he had re-entered was not the same as the one he'd left behind when he went to prison. The old dons were fading, the new generation of mobsters more ambitious and reckless. Yet, for Galante, this was no obstacle, it was an opportunity. He moved like a shadow, speaking little, but every word he uttered carried the weight of menace and certainty. He saw the Mafia not as a fading empire but as a kingdom waiting for a ruler bold enough to seize it. The Bonanno family, fractured and weakened by years of internal turmoil, was ripe for control. Galante's ambition burned quietly behind his cold smile, that same unnerving expression that had earned him the nickname, the Smiling Don. He believed he was destined to rebuild the Bonanno legacy, and he would do it with an iron fist and an army that no one could touch. To accomplish this, Galante understood one thing better than most: money was power, but control of supply was absolute power. While others squabbled over territory, gambling, and rackets, Galante saw the future in narcotics, specifically heroin. The lucrative French connection pipeline from Sicily to the U.S. had made fortunes for many, but Galante intended to make it his personal empire. He began to position his Sicilian connections, the Zips, into New York operations, loyal men who owed him everything, who spoke little English, and who feared only him. Behind the scenes, Galante's rise was not without resistance. Other Mafia families saw what he was doing and grew uneasy. The Gambinos, Genovese, and Lucchese's had all benefited from a delicate balance of power, one Galante was now threatening to destroy. They watched as he took over territories with quiet efficiency, leaving no room for negotiation. His reputation for ruthlessness spread quickly. Galante didn't threaten, he acted. If someone stood in his way, they simply disappeared. Yet, even as he tightened his grip, he kept his operations masked in calm professionalism. Meetings were held in dimly lit restaurants and cigar lounges, always under the guise of business. Galante's confidence radiated through his calm demeanor. He spoke softly, almost soothingly, when making demands that could cost men their lives. That paradox, the serenity of his tone paired with the violence that followed, made him one of the most feared men in the underworld. By the mid-1970s, Galante's narcotics network stretched from the streets of Brooklyn to the ports of Montreal, with Sicilian partners controlling the supply chain overseas. He wasn't just dealing drugs, he was running a multinational operation. The profits were staggering. Millions flowed into his accounts, and he reinvested it in real estate, restaurants, and legitimate fronts. On the surface, he appeared as a businessman with refined tastes, expensive suits, fine cigars, and a love for classical Italian meals. But beneath that exterior, his empire was built on blood and addiction. His rivals, however, began to plot in silence. The other families, already uneasy about his boldness, started whispering among themselves. They feared that if Galante consolidated the heroin trade, he would become too powerful, a dictator among dons. Even within the Bonanno family, resentment brewed. Old members felt displaced by the Sicilian newcomers. There were murmurs that Galante's arrogance could bring heat from law enforcement and chaos to their operations. But Galante ignored it all. To him, fear was a tool, not a warning. He often told his closest associates, "I've been to prison, I've been shot at, I've been hunted, and yet here I am. Nobody can touch me." That belief became his armor. But it was also his greatest blind spot. His confidence had hardened into delusion. The commission, the ruling council of the five families, had noticed his moves, and they were not pleased. To them, Galante's solo ambition was not just dangerous, it was suicidal for the balance they'd fought to maintain since the days of Lucky Luciano. And so, the silent war for power continued in the shadows, not with open gunfights, but with quiet betrayals and whispered warnings. FBI surveillance caught fragments of conversations hinting at an impending storm. Galante's men grew more guarded, more secretive. Some of his lieutenants began to look over their shoulders, wondering who they could still trust. Still, Galante remained calm, even smug. He saw himself as invincible, protected by fear and respect. But history would soon prove that in the world of organized crime, power is never owned, only borrowed, until someone stronger decides to take it. The city of New York, always alive, pulsed beneath his empire like a restless heart. From the Little Italy cafes to the Brooklyn docks, people spoke his name in hushed tones. To some, he was a legend, a man who defied the Mafia. Commission itself. To others, he was a madman too arrogant to see the noose tightening around his neck. As the nights grew longer and the tension thicker, one thing became certain, Galante's silent war for power was reaching its breaking point. And in the underworld, wars like these never end quietly. The seeds of betrayal had already been planted, and the blood that would soon spill would mark the beginning of his violent fall. He just didn't know it yet. By the mid-1970s, Carmine Galante's empire was no longer just a criminal organization, it was a shadow kingdom built on the veins of addiction. The streets of New York had become his chessboard, and heroin was his queen. From his quiet table at Joe and Mary's Italian restaurant in Brooklyn to secret warehouses in Montreal and Palermo, every move Galante made was carefully calculated to ensure one thing, that every dollar made from the drug trade passed through his hands. The narcotics network he commanded was staggering in scope. It began in the poppy fields of Turkey, where raw opium was processed into morphine base. From there, it was shipped to Sicily, where Galante's allies, the Zips, as they were called, handled the refining into pure, white heroin. The Sicilians, bound by loyalty and fear, sent the finished product across the Atlantic hidden in crates of imported goods. Once it reached the ports of Montreal, Galante's Canadian contacts ensured its safe transfer down into New York, where it flooded the streets through his tightly controlled distribution network. Every brick of heroin carried with it both wealth and death. To Galante, that duality was simply business. He viewed the drug not as poison but as profit, a product no different from liquor during Prohibition or gambling in backrooms. He often told his men, as long as there's demand, there's business. The junkies aren't our problem, they're our customers. That cold logic became the foundation of his fortune. Galante's secret weapon in this empire were the Zips, Sicilian immigrants recently brought into New York. They were fiercely loyal, speaking mostly in dialects that even American-born Italians struggled to understand. To Galante, they were perfect soldiers, disciplined, obedient, and detached from the politics of the American Mafia. These men didn't question orders, and they didn't talk. To outsiders, they appeared as quiet, polite men working odd jobs in Italian restaurants or driving delivery trucks. But behind the scenes, they were the silent engine of Galante's heroin machine. The other families began to notice the pattern. Money was disappearing from their traditional rackets, and heroin profits were flowing through Galante's hands alone. His warehouses became fortresses, heavily guarded, impossible to infiltrate. He paid his men generously, ensuring silence through loyalty and fear. Those who disobeyed or questioned him simply vanished. Some were found later, buried in shallow graves near the marshlands of Queens or floating in the Hudson River. Law enforcement, meanwhile, was struggling to keep up. The French Connection case had exposed part of the international heroin pipeline, but Galante's operation was far more sophisticated. He used coded messages, rotating safe houses, and trusted intermediaries who could pass through customs unnoticed. Federal agents knew he was behind the surge of heroin in New York but couldn't pin anything directly to him. Every trail ended in a dead end, or a dead witness. In private, Galante reveled in his success. He'd grown older, but his energy seemed boundless. He dined lavishly, puffed his signature cigars, and carried himself with the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. He saw himself not merely as a mafia boss, but as a visionary, a man who had turned a criminal organization into a global enterprise. To those close to him, he often spoke of the Bonanno family's golden age, saying he would restore it to glory through sheer force of will. But not everyone shared his vision. Within the Bonanno ranks, old-timers resented the growing influence of the Sicilians. They feared that Galante's obsession with heroin would bring unwanted heat from the FBI and destroy what was left of their traditional rackets. Even worse, they saw that Galante was keeping most of the profits for himself. He was supposed to distribute earnings among the family and, more importantly, pay tribute to the Commission, the council of mafia bosses that governed all families in the United States. But Galante ignored the old code. In his mind, he owed no one anything. His arrogance began to alarm even his closest allies. There were whispers that he was trying to crown himself as the Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses, a title that had been forbidden since the days of Salvatore Maranzano. To claim such a title was not just bold, it was suicidal. The Commission had long agreed that no one man could rule over all. Yet Galante seemed to believe he was above that rule, convinced that his wealth and connections made him unstoppable. The other families watched as Galante's heroin empire grew bolder. They saw the flow of money, the rise in overdoses, the federal investigations closing in. They saw a man who refused to share, who dismissed old alliances as relics of the past. And they began to conspire. Quietly, behind Cigar's smoke and whispered deals, the seeds of betrayal were being sown. Still, in Galante's world, everything appeared calm. The restaurants buzzed with laughter and the clink of wine glasses. The nights were filled with soft Italian music and the faint aroma of cigars. But beneath the surface, tension simmered like a pot ready to boil over. His Sicilian soldiers were loyal to him, but their loyalty to survival was stronger. If the Commission decided he was a liability, even the zips might turn. He didn't see it coming. Or perhaps he refused to. Galante believed fear would keep everyone in line forever. But fear, like power, fades when the scent of blood enters the air. The Commission's patience was wearing thin. The heroin trade had made Galante rich, but it had also made him reckless. And in the world of the Mafia, there is only one way to deal with a boss who believes he can't be touched. As summer approached, Galante continued to expand, dreaming of making the Bonanno family the most powerful in America. But far away, in quiet rooms filled with smoke and silence, men he once called allies were already signing his death warrant. The empire he'd built on heroin was about to become the stage of his destruction. And the same zips who made him powerful would soon hold the guns that would end his reign. By the late 1970s, Carmine Galante had reached the height of his power. In his mind, he was untouchable, a king ruling over a silent empire built on heroin, fear, and Sicilian loyalty. But his arrogance had made him an island, one surrounded by enemies on all sides. The more he defied the unspoken laws of the Mafia, the closer he drew to the edge of his own destruction. For decades, the Commission had been the sacred council that kept peace between the five families of New York. It was formed to prevent the bloody wars of the past, wars that once turned the streets of the city into battlegrounds. Every major decision, every leadership change, every alliance, was meant to pass through the Commission's approval. It wasn't just tradition, it was survival. But Galante no longer played by those rules. After Joseph Bonanno's fall from grace, the Bonanno family was left fractured and leaderless. Many believed the family's days of influence were over. But Galante saw it as an open invitation. Upon his release from prison in 1974, he moved swiftly to claim control. He didn't ask the Commission for permission. He didn't negotiate. He simply took it. To him, the Bonanno name was his birthright, and no one had the power to deny him. At first, his audacity went largely unchallenged. The other bosses were cautious, hoping his ambitions would fade. But Galante's appetite for power only grew. He installed his Sicilian allies in key positions, pushed aside dissenters, and began cutting into other families' rackets without warning. The Gambinos lost control of certain docks. The Lucchese's found their heroin routes disrupted. Even the Genovese, the most disciplined and calculating of all, began to lose patience. Galante wasn't just defying the Commission, he was insulting it. He refused to attend meetings, refused to send tribute, and dismissed any attempts at negotiation. When intermediaries warned him that his behavior was creating enemies, he reportedly laughed and said, "They can't stop me. Nobody can stop me." In his mind, he was above them all. The old dons were relics, cautious and slow, bound by outdated rules. Galante saw himself as the future, a visionary who would rebuild the Mafia through dominance, not diplomacy. The heroin trade, he believed, was the new frontier, and he intended to control it completely. But power has a cost, and Galante's disregard for the balance of the Commission made him a marked man. The other bosses began meeting in secret, their patience evaporating with each passing month. Paul Castellano of the Gambinos, Anthony Corallo of the Lucchese's, and Philip Rostelli, who, on paper, was the official boss of the Bonanno family, began to discuss the unthinkable, sanctioning Galante's death. The irony was bitter. Rostelli, who was supposed to be Galante's superior, had been imprisoned. Galante had essentially usurped his position, running the family as if Rostelli didn't exist. But Rostelli still had loyal men, and more importantly, he had the Commission's ear. Quietly, he fed them information about Galante's growing empire, portraying him as a threat to the stability of the entire organization. Meanwhile, law enforcement pressure was mounting. Federal agencies had begun to trace the heroin routes, connecting shipments from Sicily to Montreal and then to New York. Informants whispered Galante's name in connection with every major narcotics bust. Agents watched his every move, documenting meetings, following his cars, photographing his associates. Galante seemed unfazed. To him, the FBI was just background noise, an inconvenience at best. He had survived worse, he thought. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. The Zips, once utterly loyal, had begun to sense danger. They heard the rumors, felt the tension in the air. They knew that defying the Commission was a death sentence, no matter how powerful the man in charge seemed to be. Some started to distance themselves, quietly feeding information to other families or making contingency plans in case the storm finally broke. Yet, Galante refused to see it. He believed fear would hold his empire together forever. Every night, he dined at his favorite restaurant, Joe and Mary's, puffing on cigars and smiling that cold, eerie smile that unnerved even his closest allies. To outsiders, he appeared relaxed, a man at peace with his dominance. But to those who knew the signs, he was a man walking unknowingly toward his doom. The commission's discussions became increasingly urgent. Galante had crossed too many lines. He had disrupted too many rackets, alienated too many bosses, and ignored too many warnings. For the good of La Cosa Nostra, they agreed, he had to go. But killing a boss wasn't a decision made lightly. The execution had to be clean, swift, and sanctioned at the highest level. By 1979, the plot was quietly in motion. Rostelli, still behind bars, gave his approval. The commission members, Castellano, Corallo, and the rest, nodded in agreement. The order was clear: Carmine Galante was to be removed. The man who had thought himself untouchable would soon learn the oldest truth of all in the Mafia, that power, no matter how vast, is never absolute. And yet, in the final months before his death, Galante remained oblivious. He strutted through the streets of Brooklyn with his trademark cigar clenched between his teeth, confident and unbothered. He had no bodyguards except for 2 zips, men he trusted with his life. He still dined at the same spot, still held meetings in the open, still smiled that same chilling smile. To those watching, it was like watching a candle burn down to its final inch. Everyone knew how it would end, everyone except him. The commission had spoken in silence, and the wheels of retribution were already turning. As the summer of 1979 dawned hot and heavy over New York City, Galante's empire appeared as strong as ever. But the air around him was thick with betrayal. Somewhere in the smoke-filled rooms of Little Italy and the Bronx, men whispered his name, not with fear anymore, but with finality. And in just a few short weeks, the man who defied the commission would discover what happens to those who believe they can outlive the rules of the underworld. The next time Carmine Galante sat down to lunch, his cigar would still be burning long after he was gone. The summer sun hung heavy over Brooklyn on July 12, 1979. The heat shimmered on the asphalt, the kind that made the city feel slower, quieter, almost drowsy. But in the heart of Bushwick, inside a small Italian restaurant named Joe and Mary's, time itself was about to stop. Carmine Galante, the smiling Don, was about to sit down to his final meal, a lunch that would become one of the most infamous moments in Mafia history. To outsiders, Joe and Mary's was just another cozy neighborhood spot, known for its red checkered tablecloths, its smell of garlic and oregano, and the steady hum of conversation that floated through the air. But for Galante, it was more than a restaurant. It was familiar ground, a safe haven where he felt untouchable. He had been eating there for years, often with his Sicilian bodyguards, believing no one would dare make a move against him in broad daylight. That day, Galante arrived as he always did, sharp suit, silk shirt, and his signature cigar clamped between his teeth. His demeanor was calm, confident, even cheerful. The man was 69 years old but still radiated the swagger of his younger years. He was accompanied by 2 loyal zips, Cesare Bonventre and Baldo Amato, both of whom had been imported from Sicily and were known to be fiercely loyal to him. Inside, waiting at the table, was Leonard Coppola, another Bonanno associate. They greeted each other with the usual pleasantries, a kiss on each cheek, a clap on the back, light jokes about the heat and the state of business. To any passerby, it looked like 4 old friends sharing lunch. They ordered seafood, pasta, and wine. The atmosphere was relaxed, even joyful. But outside, in the humid Brooklyn air, death was already making its way to the table. Unknown to Galante, the commission's sanction had been finalized weeks earlier. Every major boss in New York had quietly agreed, Carmine Galante had to go. His arrogance, his greed, his total disregard for the balance of power, all of it had made him too dangerous to live. Even his supposed protectors, the Zips, had been reached by the commission. They had been given clear instructions: when the time came, they were not to interfere. Inside Joe and Mary's, Galante's lunch carried on. He spoke about money, about Sicily, about expanding operations further into Canada. He laughed, sipped his wine, puffed his cigar. He was in his element, confident that no one could touch him. He even made jokes about the FBI surveillance teams that had been tailing him for years, calling them the best audience in town. But as he sat there, relaxed and unguarded, a dark car pulled up outside. 3 men stepped out, all wearing ski masks and carrying shotguns. They moved quickly, silently, through the alleyway and into the back of the restaurant. The staff froze. Patrons dove for cover. And in an instant, the calm of the afternoon shattered like glass. Galante barely had time to react. The door burst open with a crash, and the gunman stormed into the courtyard where he and his men were eating. Shouts erupted, brief, panicked, muffled by the deafening roar of gunfire. A blast from a sawed-off shotgun tore through the air, hitting Galante square in the chest. Another followed, then another. The cigar fell from his lips as his body slammed back against the chair, the force of the impact sending him crashing to the ground. His 2 Sicilian bodyguards, Bonventre and Amato, didn't move. They didn't draw their weapons. They didn't shout or fight back. They simply stood there, unmoving, as the killers finished their work. Within seconds, it was over. Galante's white shirt was soaked in blood, his trademark cigar still resting between his teeth, a haunting image that would soon be splashed across newspapers across America. The killers vanished as quickly as they had come, disappearing into the city's labyrinth of alleys and streets. The restaurant was left in chaos, broken dishes, overturned chairs, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging heavy in the air. When the police arrived, the scene was almost surreal. Galante's body lay sprawled in the courtyard, the afternoon sun glinting off the spilled wine and shattered glass around him. The cigar, still partly lit, had burned down to its final inch. To many who saw that image later, it looked as though he had died exactly as he had lived, defiant, arrogant, and smiling in the face of death. The newspapers the next day called it the Smiling Don's final meal. The photo of Galante's lifeless body, cigar still between his teeth, became one of the most iconic mob images of all time. It was the perfect symbol of the Mafia's brutal truth: no man, no matter how powerful, is ever safe. Law enforcement immediately suspected the hit had been sanctioned by the commission. The precision of the attack, the lack of interference from his own bodyguards, and the fact that no one else in the restaurant was harmed. It all pointed to an inside job. Galante's own men had betrayed him, choosing survival over loyalty. In the aftermath, the message was clear. The old rules of the Mafia had not been broken after all. The commission still ruled, and anyone who thought otherwise would meet the same fate. Carmine Galante had believed himself to be immortal, but in the end, he became another cautionary tale, a reminder that power without restraint always ends in blood. In the days that followed, whispers spread through Little Italy, Bushwick, and beyond. Some said Galante's ghost haunted the restaurant. Others said the cigar that fell from his lips was still burning when the paramedics arrived, as if even death couldn't silence his defiance. But in truth, his story ended exactly where it had to. The Smiling Don, who thought himself above the Mafia's laws, met his end in the same world he once ruled, a world where betrayal was currency, and death was just another business transaction. As night fell over Brooklyn that day, Joe and Mary's was closed off with police tape. The streets were quiet. Somewhere, in another part of the city, the men who ordered his death raised a silent toast. And the commission, that ancient council of power, remained unchallenged, its balance restored by yet another act of blood and silence. For Carmine Galante, it was the perfect ending, not one of dignity or mercy, but of poetic justice. The man who smiled through every storm had finally met the one he couldn't weather. His cigar, once a symbol of his fearlessness, now lay in the dust, smoldering, silent, and still. The echoes of gunfire at Joe and Mary's Italian restaurant did not fade quickly. They rippled through the streets of New York like a shockwave, reaching every corner of the underworld. Carmine Galante was dead, and with his death came both relief and terror. In the world of organized crime, a man like Galante didn't die quietly. His fall created a vacuum, one that everyone wanted to fill, and no one wanted to stand too close to. The day after the hit, the tabloids screamed his death in bold black letters, "The Smiling Don Executed in Brooklyn Bloodbath." The haunting photograph of Galante's lifeless body, sprawled across the courtyard, his signature cigar still clenched between his teeth, was on every front page. To the public, it was shocking. To the Mafia, it was a warning. In Little Italy, old-timers sipped espresso in silence, shaking their heads. Some said Galante had brought it on himself, others admired the sheer audacity of the man who had dared to challenge the commission. But in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens, whispers replaced conversation. Everyone wanted to know, who gave the order? Who pulled the trigger? And most importantly, who would step into the void he left behind? Law enforcement, meanwhile, saw the hit as the ultimate proof of the Mafia's enduring reach. Despite decades of investigations, arrests, and indictments, the mob still operated with brutal precision. The FBI agents who had been tracking Galante for years could hardly believe it. They'd been preparing to take him down with charges, and instead, the Mafia had done their work for them. Behind closed doors, federal task forces began to piece together what had happened. They quickly realized that Galante's murder wasn't just a random act of vengeance, it was a sanctioned execution. The way the hit was carried out told the story: broad daylight, surgical precision, and no resistance from his guards. The two Zips who had been by his side that afternoon, Cesare Bonventre and Baldo Amato, were not victims, they were conspirators. Their decision not to draw their weapons had sealed the Don's fate. For a few days, fear hung over the Bonanno family like a cloud. No one knew who to trust. Old allies vanished. Soldiers stopped answering phone calls. Associates began to avoid familiar haunts. Everyone was waiting for the next body to drop. Because in the Mafia, death rarely came alone. But then something unexpected happened. Nothing. The killing stopped. There were no revenge hits, no open warfare, no blood in the streets. The message from the commission had been clear: Galante's death was final, and his chapter was closed. Anyone foolish enough to question that decision would share his fate. The five families, for now, had restored their balance. Behind prison walls, Philip Rostelli, the official boss of the Bonanno family, received the news with quiet satisfaction. From his cell, he had played his cards perfectly. By cooperating with the commission, he had not only removed his greatest rival but re-established himself as the legitimate head of the family. Galante's empire was now his to reclaim, though much of it had been burned down in the chaos. The Zips, those Sicilian soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to Galante, now shifted their allegiance. They claimed ignorance, saying they had been shocked by the attack, that they had frozen in fear. The commission didn't believe them, but it didn't matter. Their usefulness was not yet exhausted. For now, they were safe, but everyone knew their days were numbered. Meanwhile, Galante's death created ripples far beyond New York. In Sicily, whispers spread among the old Cosa Nostra bosses who had supplied him with heroin. His fall disrupted the entire transatlantic pipeline. The Pizza Connection network, a system of pizzerias and import companies used to launder drug money, began to fracture. Without Galante's iron control, smaller operators began to fight for dominance. The once smooth heroin operation now became unpredictable, chaotic, and more visible to law enforcement. The FBI capitalized on the chaos. Informants came forward, some out of fear, others for survival. Agents began connecting dots between Galante's operation and the growing web of Sicilian-American ties in narcotics trafficking. For years, Galante's name had been a ghost in their reports, a man too powerful to touch. But now that ghost had a body, and with it came the chance to unravel everything he had built. Inside the Bonanno family, the scramble for control intensified. Dominic, Sonny Black, Napolitano, Joseph Massino, and Cesare Bonventre each maneuvered quietly, building small networks of loyalty within the family. Everyone was cautious, remembering how quickly power could turn deadly. But beneath that caution, ambition burned. The death of a Don always lit fires in younger hearts. Still, for many, Galante's murder was a sobering lesson. The man who had once believed himself unstoppable had been taken down not by enemies, but by his own people, by the same system he had tried to dominate. His cigar, still smoldering beside him, had become a symbol of Mafia justice, swift, cold, and absolute. In the weeks following his funeral, there were no grand processions, no public tributes. Only a small group of family and close associates attended. Even among them, there was tension, everyone wondering who might be next. His grave, tucked away quietly in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, became just another resting place among dozens of other mobsters. But his legend lingered. Younger gangsters spoke of him with a mix of awe and caution, the man who had almost become king but lost it all because he refused to bow. To them, Galante represented both the dream and the curse of power in the Mafia world, the intoxicating belief that one could rise above the rules, and the inevitable truth that no one ever really does. The silence that followed his death was eerie. The Mafia world, which had trembled under his ambitions, now exhaled in uneasy peace. Yet beneath that calm, new rivalries began to simmer. The old power structures had been restored, but the hunger for control never truly vanished. Galante's empire, once dripping with money and blood, would soon be divided, devoured, and rebuilt by men who had learned from his mistakes. For now, though, the city slept. The Don who had ruled through fear was gone. His cigar, his smile, his arrogance, all reduced to a single photograph and a story told in whispers. And somewhere in the quiet corners of Brooklyn, his former allies lifted their glasses, not in mourning, but in relief. Because in the world Galante ruled, death was not the end, it was just the closing of a chapter. And the next one, as always, was already being written in the dark. After the smoke cleared from the violent end of Carmine Galante, the Bonanno family found itself leaderless, fractured, and vulnerable. The organization that had once stood as one of New York's most powerful mafia families was now haunted by ghosts, dead bosses, imprisoned capos, and soldiers unsure whom to follow. Into this void stepped a man whose name would soon command respect, fear, and, eventually, betrayal, Joseph Massino. Massino wasn't like Galante. Where Galante had been brash, loud, and ruthless, Massino was quiet, calculating, and patient. He understood that in the world of organized crime, survival wasn't just about power, it was about adaptation. Those who shouted the loudest, like Galante, died first. Those who moved in silence lasted the longest. Born and raised in Maspeth, Queens, Massino started out as a truck hijacker in the 1960s. He wasn't flashy or impulsive, he preferred to make his money quietly, without unnecessary attention. His early mentors noticed that unlike most young gangsters, Massino didn't crave violence, he craved control. He studied people, memorized routines, and always thought 3 moves ahead. When Galante returned from prison and began asserting dominance, Massino had kept his distance. He saw the writing on the wall long before the bullets flew at Joe and Mary's. To him, Galante's arrogance wasn't strength, it was suicide. So, when the commission approved the hit, Massino didn't just breathe easier, he saw opportunity. With Philip Rostelli still imprisoned but technically the family's boss, Massino began to quietly consolidate power on the streets. Officially, he was just a soldier. In reality, he was the most organized man in the Bonanno ranks. He began rebuilding the family from the inside out, restoring discipline, creating new revenue streams, and mending relationships with the other 5 families that Galante had alienated. His leadership style earned him a new reputation, the Quiet Don. Unlike Galante's reign of terror, Massino's approach was methodical. He understood that the Mafia's golden rule, Cosa Nostra is a secret society, had been lost to ego and chaos. He wanted to bring it back. His mantra was simple, we don't talk. We don't show off. We make money. One of his first strategic moves was to establish a strong alliance with Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano, a respected capo who commanded loyalty from his men. Sonny Black was old school, a believer in honor and respect. Together, they began restructuring the family, removing unreliable members, and reinstating order. Their partnership gave the Bonannos a stability they hadn't seen since the days of Joe Bonanno himself. But there was danger lurking in the shadows. In 1979, around the same time as Galante's death, an undercover FBI agent had begun infiltrating the Mafia under the alias Donnie Brasco. His real name was Joseph Pistone, and he had slowly worked his way into the Bonanno circle by posing as a jewel thief. Unbeknownst to Massino and Sonny Black, the seeds of destruction had already been planted. As Massino tightened his grip on operations, he prioritized one thing above all: loyalty. He reorganized the family structure, made sure money flowed smoothly from crews to capos, and reminded everyone that the Mafia was a business, not a battlefield. Under his guidance, the Bonannos began regaining lost respect within the commission. By the early 1980s, Massino's influence had grown quietly but steadily. His rise wasn't marked by bloodshed or public headlines, it was marked by results. Construction rackets, loan sharking, gambling, and drug profits began to flourish again. His reputation extended beyond the family. Other bosses in New York admired his discipline. Even the commission began to view him as the stabilizing force the Bonannos desperately needed. Yet, Massino's calm demeanor masked a dangerous intelligence. He understood the lessons of Galante's death all too well: ambition without restraint was fatal. He never spoke to outsiders, rarely appeared in public, and avoided drawing the attention of law enforcement. While other bosses flaunted power through luxury cars and expensive suits, Massino preferred subtlety. He drove modest vehicles, held meetings in diners, and avoided being photographed. But power, even quiet power, breeds enemies. Some within the family believed that Massino was too controlling, too paranoid. He demanded absolute obedience, and anyone who questioned his authority was swiftly marginalized. Still, no one dared challenge him directly. His word was law, and his results spoke for themselves. Meanwhile, the FBI's infiltration through Donnie Brasco began to unravel everything. Sonny Black, one of Massino's closest allies, unknowingly welcomed the undercover agent deeper into the family's operations. When the Bureau finally exposed the operation in 1981, the Mafia world was thrown into chaos. Sonny Black was executed for the humiliation, his body left as a warning to others. Massino, devastated but pragmatic, used the disaster as a lesson in how deeply the FBI had infiltrated the Mafia. From that moment, his paranoia intensified. He began to treat secrecy not as an ideal, but as a weapon. Meetings were held in coded locations, phones were never trusted, and discussions about family business took place only face-to-face. The Bonannos under Massino became the most elusive crime family in America. Law enforcement called him the Last Don, because he was the last major Mafia boss to truly operate under the old rules. In his own way, Massino became everything Galante had wanted to be, but without the noise. He controlled the heroin trade quietly, expanded influence across multiple rackets, and rebuilt the Bonanno legacy. He understood diplomacy, knew when to bribe and when to kill, and managed to stay out of prison for nearly 2 decades. By the late 1980s, the transformation was complete. The Bonanno family was no longer the broken, chaotic organization it had been after Galante's fall. Under Massino's leadership, it became leaner, smarter, and deadlier. He had succeeded where others had failed, not through fear, but through structure. And yet, beneath his calm exterior, Massino's ambition never truly died. He wanted recognition, the kind that Galante had chased, not from the public, but from within the underworld. He wanted to be seen as the true Don, the man who brought the Bonannos back from extinction. For years, it seemed he had done just that. But history has a cruel way of repeating itself. Just as Galante's power had made him a target, so too would Massino's quiet empire attract attention, from the commission, from rivals, and eventually, from the one force even the Mafia could never silence: the United States government. For now, though, Joseph Massino stood unchallenged. The quiet Don had restored order to chaos, silence to noise, and control to a world ruled by greed. In the dark corners of New York's underworld, his name carried weight once more. The Bonanno family was alive again, reborn not in fire and blood, but in the stillness of fear. By the dawn of the 1990s, Joseph Massino had accomplished what many thought impossible. He had resurrected the Bonanno family from the ashes of scandal and bloodshed. Under his quiet and disciplined leadership, the organization once again thrived, operating efficiently across loan sharking, gambling, and narcotics distribution. Yet, while his men toasted their success in dimly lit social clubs, Massino remained watchful. He knew better than anyone that prosperity in the Mafia came with a price: attention. And the attention now came from the one enemy who never forgot, the FBI. For decades, the Bureau had battled the Mafia. Like a shadow war, patient, methodical, relentless. But by the 1990s, technology, surveillance, and informant networks had evolved. The FBI no longer relied solely on street-level arrests, it now targeted the infrastructure of organized crime itself. Through the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, law enforcement could dismantle entire families, not just individuals. For the Bonannos, this meant the old days of hiding behind silence were over. Every conversation, every transaction, every careless whisper could become a weapon against them. Massino knew this and adapted accordingly. He forbade his men from using phones, insisted on face-to-face meetings, and implemented elaborate counter-surveillance measures. The Bonanno family became so secretive that for a time, investigators struggled to find any leads. Other Mafia families still made headlines for high-profile arrests, but the Bonannos seemed to have vanished into the city's underbelly. FBI agents began to refer to them as the Ghost Family. But ghosts, however quiet, still leave traces. The Bureau's new generation of agents, trained in electronic surveillance, undercover infiltration, and psychological manipulation, were determined to find cracks in Massino's carefully constructed armor. The FBI's New York office created Operation Donnie Brasco II, an informal nickname for their renewed campaign to expose the Bonannos. They began following money trails, flipping low-level associates, and using sophisticated listening devices that could capture whispers through walls. One of the key figures who caught their attention was Anthony "Tony" Green Urso, a Bonanno capo known for managing the family's rackets in Queens. Urso's operations were profitable but also careless. Through a combination of surveillance and informant cooperation, the FBI started piecing together the network connecting Urso's crew to Massino himself. The Bureau understood that Massino was too smart to be caught in direct criminal acts, so they aimed to build a web of circumstantial evidence, a trail of money, meetings, and whispers that all pointed to the quiet Don. Meanwhile, inside the family, paranoia was spreading like a slow poison. The ghosts of past betrayals, the Donnie Brasco affair, the assassination of Galante, the countless internal wars, still haunted them. Massino, though outwardly calm, grew increasingly suspicious of everyone around him. His leadership meetings became shorter, his circle smaller. He trusted only a handful of men, including his brother-in-law Salvatore Vitali, a man who had served him loyally for decades. Together, they operated almost as co-bosses, Vitali managing logistics, Massino overseeing strategy. The FBI, however, saw Vitali as the potential weak link. He was powerful but prideful, and in time, resentment began to simmer between the two men. Massino had always been careful to present himself as the ultimate authority, and Vitali's ego occasionally chafed under his brother-in-law's quiet dominance. The Bureau didn't need to create conflict, it merely waited for human nature to do the work. By the mid-1990s, the FBI's patience began to pay off. Wiretaps captured faint echoes of conversations that hinted at Massino's control. Surveillance photos showed him meeting with known capos in discreet parking lots and diners. Informants, motivated by fear or money, began feeding small but valuable details, coded phrases, cash drops, safe houses. Slowly, the Bureau assembled the pieces. The breakthrough came when an ambitious agent uncovered evidence of the Bonanno's growing influence in Montreal's drug trade, an empire first established under Galante. This discovery linked the family to international narcotics trafficking once again, a federal crime that carried severe penalties. For prosecutors, it was the perfect leverage point. For Massino, it was a ticking clock. Still, Massino believed he could stay ahead. His caution bordered on obsession. He refused to utter his own name during meetings. Referring to himself as "that guy" or simply pointing upward when discussed. He even assigned nicknames to capos based on saints, ensuring that any recorded conversation would sound like harmless religious chatter. To outsiders, these methods seemed paranoid. To Massino, they were survival. But even the most careful man can't control everything. The Bonanno family's expanding operations created new vulnerabilities. Street-level soldiers, driven by greed, began making mistakes, fighting over territory, skimming money, or drawing unnecessary attention. The FBI seized on each one, flipping minor associates into informants. They didn't need to bring down Massino overnight, they just needed to erode his empire piece by piece. Inside the Bureau's command center, a growing wall of evidence began to form. Photos of meetings, ledgers from gambling operations, and transcripts from bugged rooms all pointed in one direction. The name Massino appeared more frequently, always surrounded by coded references but unmistakably tied to decisions, profits, and murders. By 1999, federal prosecutors believed they were close to making history. For Massino, the signs of danger became impossible to ignore. He noticed FBI tails more frequently. He changed cars daily, rotated safe houses, and even began sending decoys to meetings. Yet, despite his vigilance, the noose was tightening. A single slip-up, a careless conversation, an untrustworthy ally, was all it would take. What Massino didn't yet know was that his greatest threat wasn't an FBI agent or an informant on the street. It was sitting beside him at the table, sharing his meals, his secrets, and his blood. Salvatore Vitali, the man he trusted most, was beginning to question everything. The FBI could feel it too. They knew from experience that every empire, no matter how silent or strong, eventually cracked from within. They had broken Gotti, crushed the Gambinos, and now, with patience and precision, they were closing in on the last untouchable Don. As the millennium approached, the quiet shadows of the Bonanno family began to tremble under the fluorescent lights of FBI offices. Somewhere in a sealed evidence room, an agent pinned a photograph of Massino to the wall and circled it in red. Beneath it, a note in careful handwriting read, "The last real Don. Bring him down." The hunt had officially begun. And this time, no amount of silence would be enough to save him. By the turn of the millennium, the bond between Joseph Massino and his brother-in-law, Salvatore, good-looking Sal, Vitali, had become the backbone of the Bonanno family. Their partnership had begun decades earlier on the gritty streets of Queens, Massino the mastermind, Vitali the loyal enforcer. Together, they had built an empire from the rubble left behind by Carmine Galante's bloody downfall. But what once seemed unbreakable was now beginning to fracture, piece by piece, under the weight of paranoia, greed, and the relentless pressure of the FBI. To outsiders, Vitali appeared untouchable, a powerful underboss with wealth, influence, and the protection of one of the most cautious dons in Mafia history. Yet beneath that polished image lay growing resentment. For years, he had been the man behind the scenes, orchestrating the family's day-to-day operations while Massino took the credit. Vitali's pride was wounded, though he rarely showed it. He was tired of being second, tired of the shadows. Massino, meanwhile, had grown increasingly distrustful of everyone, even those closest to him. The FBI's quiet war against the Bonannos had forced him into isolation. Every arrest, every whisper of a potential informant, deepened his paranoia. He started making decisions unilaterally, cutting Vitali out of critical conversations. To Massino, this wasn't personal, it was survival. But to Vitali, it felt like betrayal. The tension simmered behind polite smiles. At dinners, Massino would talk about loyalty, about how blood was sacred. Vitali would nod, but inside, something had shifted. He began noticing things he had once ignored, the way Massino's eyes followed him, the lack of trust in his tone, the sudden silence in conversations when he entered the room. The man he had once called a brother now seemed more like a warden. Then came the arrests. The FBI's investigation, years in the making, had finally gathered enough evidence to launch a full-scale offensive. In January 2003, federal agents struck with precision, raiding homes, social clubs, and businesses tied to the Bonanno network. Dozens of mobsters were taken into custody, including high-ranking members of Massino's inner circle. But the biggest blow came when Salvatore Vitali himself was arrested on a host of racketeering and murder charges. For Massino, the arrest was both expected and terrifying. He had always known the FBI would come for them eventually, but he believed his silence and discipline would protect him. Still, the thought of Vitali being interrogated unsettled him. He trusted Sal, he always had, but prison had a way of breaking even the strongest men. In his cell, Vitali sat quietly, reflecting on a lifetime of loyalty. The walls seemed to whisper accusations: you killed for him. You bled for him. And now you sit here alone. The bureau didn't rush him. They knew better. Time was their weapon. They let the isolation work its poison. They showed him photographs of his wife, his children, his empty home. They hinted that Massino had already begun protecting himself, moving assets, preparing escape routes. Whether true or not, it planted a seed of doubt that would soon grow roots. Weeks turned into months. The FBI kept up the psychological pressure. They promised nothing and hinted at everything. Vitali's lawyers told him that without cooperation, he could face life in prison, maybe even the death penalty for his alleged involvement in multiple murders. The old Mafia code of silence, omerta, was cracking. The new generation of mobsters no longer viewed prison as an honor, it was a graveyard for forgotten loyalties. Finally, the unthinkable happened. In 2003, Salvatore Vitali, Massino's most trusted lieutenant, his own brother-in-law, agreed to cooperate with the FBI. The news rippled through the underworld like an earthquake. For the first time, someone at the very top of the Bonanno hierarchy had turned government witness. And it wasn't just anyone, it was family. Vitali's betrayal wasn't driven solely by fear, it was also revenge. In his mind, Massino had abandoned him, treated him as expendable. If loyalty was a two-way street, then Massino had already broken it. When FBI agents asked why he finally decided to talk, Vitali reportedly said, "Because he would have done it to me first." Once Vitali began to speak, the floodgates opened. He provided prosecutors with an unprecedented inside view of the Bonanno family's operations, details about murders, money laundering, and internal politics that no one outside the organization had ever heard before. He named names, revealed hideouts, and described meetings that tied Massino directly to criminal enterprises. His testimony painted a chilling picture of Massino's leadership. While the quiet Don had long cultivated an image of calm intelligence, Vitali exposed the darker truth: his manipulation, his paranoia, his obsession with control. He described how Massino had ordered hits on anyone he suspected of disloyalty, how he had structured the family to protect himself above all else. The FBI couldn't have asked for a more credible or damaging witness. Back in his cell, Massino received the news with a cold, hollow stare. The man who had once been his closest ally, the one who knew all his secrets, was now testifying against him. For a man who had built his empire on silence and loyalty, it was the ultimate humiliation. Sal flipped, whispered one agent to another during a surveillance debrief. The last Don just lost his last friend. Vitali's cooperation gave prosecutors everything they needed to finalize their case. They prepared a sweeping RICO indictment that charged Massino with murder, extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and a host of other crimes. It was the culmination of years of patient, methodical work, a legal masterpiece designed to dismantle the Bonanno empire once and for all. When the trial began, the courtroom was electric. Reporters crowded the halls, eager to witness history. For decades, Massino had been the ghost, the man the FBI could never touch. Now he sat in a suit, expression unreadable, facing the weight of his own creation. Across the room, Salvatore Vitali took the stand. Their eyes met briefly, brother-in-law to brother-in-law, don to underboss, betrayer to betrayed. In that silent exchange, an entire era ended. Vitali spoke calmly, describing crimes with the same precision one might use to recount the weather. Each word was a dagger, each recollection another link in the chain that would bind Massino forever. The courtroom was silent, save for the scratching of pens and the faint hum of air conditioning. When he finished, even the defense attorneys knew, the case was over. For the Bonanno family, Vitali's defection was catastrophic. It shattered morale, exposed operations, and destroyed the illusion of invincibility. The man who once enforced loyalty through fear had been undone by the one person he trusted most. As the verdict loomed, one truth became undeniable. The age of the quiet dawn was nearing its end. The empire he had built through cunning and discipline was collapsing, not through bullets or betrayal in the streets, but through whispered words in a courtroom. In the Mafia, death is expected. Betrayal is not. And for Joseph Massino, betrayal had come wearing his own family's face. The courtroom was hushed as Joseph Massino, the last true don of New York's Mafia, took his seat at the defense table. For more than 2 decades, he had ruled in whispers, his voice seldom recorded, his commands carried through loyal intermediaries, his empire thriving in the shadows. Now, those same shadows had turned against him. The year was 2004, and after years of surveillance, arrests, and betrayals, the U.S. government had finally placed him in the spotlight. The United States versus Joseph Massino wasn't just another mob trial, it was a reckoning, the final chapter in a story that began with the fall of Carmine Galante and the rebirth of the Bonanno family. From the first day, the air in the courtroom felt electric. Journalists filled every seat, pens poised to capture history in real time. FBI agents who had spent half their careers chasing the Bonannos sat quietly in the back, faces unreadable. For them, this was the culmination of decades of work. They had watched Massino rise from a truck hijacker to the most disciplined don in America, and now, finally, they would watch him fall. The prosecution opened with methodical precision. They called Salvatore, good-looking Sal, Vitali, Massino's brother-in-law and former underboss, as their star witness. When Vitali took the stand, all eyes turned to Massino. For a moment, the don didn't move. His expression was calm, unreadable, as though he were listening to a business report rather than his own betrayal. But his eyes, dark, unblinking, never left Vitali. The prosecutors began their questioning gently, almost conversationally. Vitali's answers were measured, emotionless. He detailed meetings, coded conversations, and orders that led to murder. He spoke of envelopes of cash passed quietly in diners, of secret hand signals, of loyalty turned into obedience. Each word was like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through the courtroom's silence. When he was asked about Massino's leadership, Vitali didn't hesitate. He was the boss, he said simply. He made every major decision. Nothing happened without his approval. The jury sat motionless, absorbing each revelation. It wasn't just that Vitali's testimony was detailed, it was credible. He wasn't boasting or embellishing, he was explaining. He described how Massino had demanded absolute secrecy, how he had used coded language and gestures to communicate, how meetings were always held in different locations to avoid surveillance. The very discipline that had once protected Massino was now being weaponized against him, each precaution reframed as evidence of guilt. The prosecution then unveiled a trove of surveillance photos, wiretap transcripts, and financial records. Some showed Massino dining with known capos, others documented money transfers tied to illegal gambling and loan sharking operations. None of it was dramatic on its own, but together it formed a pattern, a web of influence and control that only one man could have orchestrated. Massino's defense team tried to portray him as a retired businessman unfairly targeted by overzealous prosecutors. They argued that the Mafia had long since faded, that Massino was being punished for the sins of others. But their arguments were drowned beneath the weight of evidence. The jurors could see the meticulous organization, the hierarchy, the unspoken chain of command. They could see the quiet Don, not as a relic of the past, but as the last practitioner of an ancient criminal art. As the days turned into weeks, the emotional toll became apparent. Former allies testified. Some were broken men, their loyalty shattered by fear. Others spoke with quiet regret, painting a portrait of Massino as both father figure and tyrant. Each story deepened the image of a man who had built an empire on fear and precision but who had ultimately been consumed by both. One of the most haunting moments came when the prosecution presented photos of victims, men who had vanished under Massino's rule, their fates sealed in whispered meetings and unmarked graves. Among them was Gerland Jerry Chili, a low-level associate believed to have been killed for talking too much. When asked about the murders, Vitali's face tightened. "It was business," he said. That's how he saw it. Throughout it all, Massino remained silent. He refused to testify, refused to acknowledge the betrayal, refused to show emotion. His stillness became part of his legend. Even as the prosecution dismantled his empire piece by piece, he sat with the same calm he had once displayed in the back rooms of Brooklyn restaurants. But inside, the silence was breaking. During recesses, agents observed him leaning close to his lawyers, whispering furiously. He knew the evidence was overwhelming. His financial ledgers had been seized, his inner circle had turned, and his brother-in-law's testimony had obliterated the last shred of plausible deniability. Each new witness tightened the noose. By mid-July 2004, the prosecution had rested its case. When the defense declined to call additional witnesses, everyone in the courtroom understood why. There was nothing left to say. The jury deliberated for just 5 days before returning their verdict. Guilty on all counts. When the words were read aloud, the room fell silent. There were no outbursts, no tears, just the quiet sound of a legacy ending. Massino's expression didn't change. He looked straight ahead, hands folded neatly on the table, as though listening to an expected business report. To those who watched him closely, it was eerily familiar, the same composure, the same unshakable calm that had defined him for decades. But the real shock came after the trial. Facing multiple life sentences and the possibility of the death penalty for ordering the murder of 3 Bonanno captains in the early 1980s, Massino made a decision that stunned even his enemies. The man who had enforced silence as a sacred rule, who had rebuilt his family around secrecy, who had executed men for breaking omerta, offered to cooperate with the government. The news hit the Mafia world like a thunderclap. Joseph Massino, the quiet Don, had flipped. Federal agents who had spent years pursuing him could hardly believe it. Some thought it was a bluff, others suspected a trap. But it was real. In private meetings with prosecutors, Massino began sharing the inner workings of the Bonanno family, the codes, the structure, the hidden bank accounts, the murders long thought unsolved. For the first time in history, a sitting Mafia boss, not a capo or underboss, had become an informant. It was a betrayal so profound that even seasoned agents were speechless. The last Don had broken the last code. When asked why he did it, Massino's answer was simple: because I didn't want to die in prison. For a man who had once ruled with quiet certainty, it was the ultimate irony, his empire destroyed not by rivals, but by his own fear of mortality. That summer, as Massino began recounting decades of secrets behind closed doors, one chapter of Mafia history ended, and another began. The age of the old Dons, the men who ruled from the shadows, was over. The silence that had once protected them had finally turned into a confession. When Joseph Massino decided to cooperate with the government, it wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a seismic event that shattered the very foundation of mafia culture. For more than a century, the cornerstone of organized crime had been omerta, the sacred vow of silence. To betray the family was to betray one's blood, one's soul, and one's honor. Men had died keeping that vow, some had gone to prison for life rather than speak a single word. And now, the last true Don, the very man who had once ordered executions to preserve that silence, had broken it himself. The news spread like wildfire through the underworld. Across New York, in the smoky backrooms of social clubs and small restaurants, whispers carried disbelief. Massino flipped, they said. The boss talked. It sounded impossible, almost sacrilegious. This was the man who had resurrected the Bonanno family from chaos, who had punished leaks with ruthless precision, who had prided himself on being untouchable because of his discipline. Yet here he was, not only talking, but testifying. For the first time in modern mafia history, a sitting boss had agreed to wear a wire. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit meeting rooms of the Metropolitan Correctional Center, Massino met with federal agents and prosecutors for hours, recounting decades of secrets. The conversations were recorded, transcribed, and archived like sacred texts of betrayal. He spoke calmly, methodically, detailing who gave which order, where the bodies were buried, and how money flowed between shell companies and offshore accounts. But his cooperation wasn't just about information, it was about self-preservation. Massino knew he would die in prison if he didn't act. Facing multiple life sentences, the Don who had built his empire on silence now saw words as his only weapon. His confession was a currency of survival. He revealed the inner mechanics of the Bonanno family, the hierarchy, the code, the meeting rituals, and even the subtle hand gestures used to identify members. He mapped out entire networks of influence stretching from New York to Canada, and even into Sicily. One by one, the names of men who had once sworn allegiance to him were written into federal reports. The FBI agents who debriefed him later said that Massino's knowledge was astonishing. He remembered dates, details, conversations, and crimes with photographic precision. He even helped prosecutors understand how orders were relayed, often through indirect messages that seemed meaningless to outsiders. What had once been a secret language of power was now a dictionary of evidence. The impact of Massino's betrayal rippled through every level of organized crime. In prison yards, older wise guys shook their heads in disbelief. Some refused to believe it was true, calling it government propaganda. Others cursed his name in quiet tones, aware that if he could break, anyone could. For the Bonanno family, the damage was catastrophic. Massino's testimony led to a wave of indictments, targeting high-ranking members who had managed to survive previous purges. Decades of secrecy unraveled in months. The organization that had once prided itself on being the most disciplined family in New York was now crumbling from within. When word reached Vincent Basciano, Massino's acting boss and former protégé, he was stunned. Basciano had always admired Massino, considering him the embodiment of old-school loyalty and strength. But soon after Massino's cooperation began, he found himself under investigation. It wasn't long before federal agents approached him with transcripts. Massino had secretly recorded their conversations while in custody. The shock was indescribable. To the underworld, this was the ultimate betrayal. Not only had Massino spoken, he had actively spied on his own successor. The once revered last Don had turned into the government's most powerful weapon against his own creation. The agents played the recordings in court. On the tapes, Massino's soft, calculated voice could be heard discussing past murders, business operations, and even hinting at old scores. Every word was a nail in the coffin of the Mafia's ancient code. For the first time, the silence of the underworld had been replaced by the hum of hidden microphones and the clatter of courtroom keyboards. As these revelations surfaced, many wondered what had truly broken Massino. Was it fear? Age? The erosion of a world that no longer existed? Some said he had been a realist. He understood that the Mafia had changed, that the Days of honor and secrecy were over. Others believed it was cowardice, plain and simple. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. In his mind, Massino had spent a lifetime playing by the rules of a game that no longer worked. Technology, informants, and federal laws had turned the Mafia into a losing proposition. The FBI's RICO Act had made it possible to take down entire organizations with a single case. Wiretaps and surveillance had replaced street loyalty. The romantic image of La Cosa Nostra, the honored society, was fading fast, replaced by fear, paranoia, and betrayal. And perhaps the greatest irony of all was that Massino himself had once been the architect of that paranoia. His strict rules, his obsession with secrecy, his execution of traitors, it had all created a culture of fear. But fear was a double-edged sword. The same fear that once silenced others now consumed him. In his private meetings with prosecutors, Massino reportedly showed no remorse for the crimes he had committed, only for the position he found himself in. He often spoke of business decisions, referring to murders and betrayals as necessary actions. To him, cooperating wasn't a moral failure, it was a strategic pivot. In his world, survival had always been the ultimate goal, and this was simply another way to survive. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. For decades, omerta had been treated as sacred law, stronger than religion, stronger even than family. But when the last dawn broke it, it proved something devastating, that no one was immune. Not the old-timers who swore oaths in smoke-filled rooms, not the rising stars who dreamed of becoming bosses. The code had been cracked, and once it broke, it could never be mended. In the months that followed, Massino's cooperation led to multiple convictions and the near collapse of the Bonanno hierarchy. He even provided testimony that helped solve cold cases from the 1980s, giving closure to victims' families who had long since given up hope. In exchange, his death sentence was taken off the table, and his life was spared. But his legacy was gone. To many in the underworld, he would forever be remembered not as the man who restored the Bonanno family, but as the man who ended it. The Quiet Don, once revered for his silence, would go down in history as the Don who finally spoke. And in that moment, the Mafia's greatest illusion, that loyalty was eternal, was exposed for what it had always been, a myth built on fear, destined to collapse the moment fear lost its power. Decades after Carmine Galante's bloody end in that Brooklyn courtyard, his ghost continued to linger in the corners of Mafia history. His reign had been short but unforgettable, and the echoes of his ambition haunted every generation that came after him. Galante's death had not merely ended a man, it had ended an era. The cigar still clamped between his teeth when he died became one of the most chilling symbols in organized crime lore. To many, it represented arrogance, to others, defiance. But either way, it reminded everyone of what power could cost when a man believed himself untouchable. By the 1990s and early 2000s, the world had changed, but Galante's name still drifted through conversations in old Mafia haunts, whispered between aging wise guys in corner booths and remembered by younger soldiers as a cautionary tale. His photograph, often shown to new recruits, carried an unspoken warning: this is what happens when you reach too far. In the mythology of the Mafia, Galante had become both legend and lesson, a man who sought to be king in a world that could never allow one. Those who had known him remembered a paradox. Galante was a man of calm confidence, almost serene in conversation, yet capable of savage violence without hesitation. His smile, the one that earned him his infamous nickname, wasn't one of warmth. It was a mask, a thin veil over the volcanic rage that simmered beneath. When he was alive, that smile could make men feel both safe and terrified. In death, it became an emblem of his twisted duality, charm and cruelty fused into one unforgettable image. As years passed, Galante's empire dissolved, but the shadow of his influence remained. The Sicilian zips he had brought into the American underworld continued to operate quietly, their loyalty to him transforming into a network that outlived its master. They spread across the heroin trade, infiltrating other families, keeping alive the routes and methods Galante had pioneered. Law enforcement would later uncover remnants of his old smuggling lines still functioning decades after his death, subtle proof that even in failure, Galante's ideas had endured. In FBI debriefings and wiretap recordings from the late 1980s, older mobsters occasionally spoke of Galante with a mix of awe and bitterness. "He could have been the boss of bosses," one aging capo once said, "if he just played ball." But Galante never wanted to play, he wanted to rule. That defiance, that refusal to bend, became both the heart of his legend and the cause of his destruction. The Commission never forgave him for ignoring their authority, for acting like a king in a world built on shared power. His assassination had not been an act of vengeance, it had been an act of balance. Still, the fascination with his story only grew. Writers, journalists, and filmmakers returned to it again and again, drawn by the contradictions that defined him. He was the man who wanted to unite the old world and the new, who dreamed of building a Sicilian dynasty on American soil. Yet, in his pursuit of absolute control, he had only managed to hasten his own downfall. Documentaries described his life as a Shakespearean tragedy, a rise fueled by brilliance and ambition, and a fall ignited by pride. Among the criminal world, however, his legend lived differently. Some young gangsters in the late 20th century looked up to him, admiring his audacity and independence. They saw in him the purest embodiment of power, unafraid, unyielding, unstoppable. To them, Galante was proof that one man could still shape the Mafia according to his own will. But the older generation, those who had seen his empire collapse firsthand, offered a harsher lesson. They spoke of him not as a hero, but as a warning against hubris. "You can't be bigger than the table," one old soldier would mutter, meaning that no one could rise above the Commission, no matter how strong or ruthless. In the world beyond the Mafia, his story became symbolic of something larger, the end of the romanticized gangster. Galante's life marked a transition from the era of suits and secret handshakes to the modern age of wiretaps, FBI informants, and televised trials. The mystique of the Mafia had begun to crumble, replaced by the harsh reality of federal crackdowns and betrayal. Galante's refusal to adapt, his insistence on ruling by fear rather than diplomacy, revealed how the old world of honor and secrecy could no longer survive in the new America. His death scene, that sunlit patio in Bushwick, the plate of pasta unfinished, the cigar still smoldering, became a morbid image burned into Mafia history. Even detectives who arrived at the scene years ago recalled it vividly. The blood on the tiles. The shocked faces of the other men. The quiet after the gunfire, like the city itself had paused for a breath. There was something haunting about it, as though Galante had known it would end that way, and met it with the same calm smile he had worn all his life. In interviews decades later, retired FBI agents admitted that Galante's assassination had been one of the few Mafia hits they had expected but couldn't stop. Everyone in the underworld had seen it coming. His enemies were too many, his arrogance too public. But Galante's story wasn't about surprise, it was about inevitability. His fate had been sealed the moment he declared himself king. Even now, historians and criminologists study his legacy as a turning point. Galante's empire had briefly shown what the Mafia could achieve if unified under one man, and why such unity was impossible. He demonstrated that pure power without restraint was unsustainable. His downfall reinforced the unspoken law that no boss could rise above the collective will of the five families. And yet, there was something undeniably magnetic about his myth. The image of the cigar-chewing Don, sitting confidently moments before death, had become iconic, a symbol of the Mafia's tragic allure. It captured the paradox of organized crime, the illusion of control, the seduction of power, and the certainty of ruin. Today, the restaurant where he was killed has long since closed, replaced by modern businesses that know little of the blood spilled there. The neighborhood has changed, the old Mafia haunts replaced by gentrified cafes and apartments. But in the whispers of history, Carmine Galante's story still drifts like smoke, the echo of a man who believed he could defy the very order of the underworld. He may have been killed by his own men, betrayed by his peers, and erased from the Commission's records, but his legend endures, not because he was loved or admired, but because he dared to do what few ever attempted. He tried to become the absolute ruler of a world built on shadows, and for a brief, unforgettable moment, he almost succeeded. In the aftermath of Galante's brutal death, the Mafia wasted no time reclaiming balance. His empire, once built on fear and foreign drug routes, was dismantled overnight. The Commission quietly divided his assets, his loyalists vanished, and his name was spoken only in whispers. It was as if the smiling Don had never existed. But his death sent a clear message: no man, no matter how feared, could defy the old code. The photograph of his lifeless body became both warning and prophecy: arrogance has no place in the Mafia. The streets of New York grew quieter, colder, as if exhaling after years of chaos. For those who once followed him, Galante's end wasn't just the fall of a man, it was the death of an era. His cigar burned out, and with it, the last illusion of invincibility in the underworld. Time has a way of turning even the darkest men into legend. Decades after Carmine Galante's death, his name still drifts through the air like cigar smoke, faint, but impossible to erase. That final photograph of him slumped in a chair, cigar still between his teeth, became an icon of defiance. It captured the essence of a man who believed he could outlive fear itself. Galante's legacy is both admiration and warning. To some, he was the last true mafioso, bold, ruthless, and unyielding. To others, he was the architect of his own downfall, blinded by pride. His death symbolized more than revenge, it marked the end of an era when men ruled the streets by charisma and violence alone. Even now, his ghost lingers in New York's shadows, reminder of how power devours those who believe they can command it forever. In life, Carmine Galante feared nothing, not death, not betrayal. In death, he achieved what he always wanted: immortality through infamy.